The idea of heaven, a blissful realm where everything and everyone exists in a state of joyful harmony, has been a constant human preoccupation. For some, it exists somewhere in the sky. For others, it's a vision of nature itself. And there are those who hold it to be right here on Earth. I'm going to be looking at why so many human beings have this broadly shared concept, how it manifests itself in different religions across the world, and how artists have attempted to create heavenly visions over the centuries. This image of heaven by the Italian Renaissance painter Luca Signorelli probably comes as close as any to how most people in the West imagine it to be. It's filled with angels singing and playing musical instruments. There are billowing clouds, and of course, there are beautiful people for whom the promise of paradise has come true. But has heaven always been a place of fluffy clouds? A celestial realm beyond earthly understanding? Some of the earliest depictions of a heavenly realm would suggest quite the opposite. The ancient Egyptian concept of heaven, known as the Field of Reeds, was certainly more down to earth. It was a heaven where crops were more bountiful than ever, and giant fruit hung from trees. But it was a place in which, in many ways, life continued much as it had done before. Later, in Greek thought, it took some time for a clear idea of heaven to emerge. Initially, all were destined to end up in the underworld, known as Hades, a shadowy place for good and bad alike. But there was a problem.
People would say, well, what's the point of leading a virtuous life if I just spend eternity in the same place as everybody else? So those gradations, those ideas of judgment started entering. And those who'd led virtuous lives, particularly in the writings of Plato, you'll see that they end up by going to the Elysian fields or the Isles of the Blessed, these kind of rather wonderful places of joy and fulfillment.
The Elysian fields, which first appear in Homer's epic poem The Odyssey, are imagined as a paradise of green meadows, delicious life-giving air, and softly glowing sunlight. It's a place of peace and blessedness. The Romans readily adopted this idea. In this fragment of Roman fresco, we can see how an artist imagined the Elysian fields, with the god Mercury dancing with little children among what looked like giant roses. A culture and religion that grew up alongside the Greco-Roman world was that of ancient Judaism. In the Jewish faith, heaven only really began to emerge as a response to changing circumstances. Initially, it seems that there was no real need for a heaven. The Jews, like the Greeks, believed that everyone ended up in the same place after death, a shadowy underworld known as Sheol, no matter how you behaved on earth. But after Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians in the 6th century BC, the Jewish people were forced into exile, and a clearer idea of heaven began to emerge. It focused on a rebuilt Jerusalem, a heavenly city where the living and the dead existed side by side under the protective power of God. After the Jewish people were exiled from their homeland for a second time under the Romans and went on to suffer hardships for centuries to come, the idea of a heavenly realm remained an enticing prospect. But what does the Jewish idea of heaven actually look like? Unlike Christianity, in which art played a very prominent role, Judaism had a problematic relationship with figurative representation, let alone the depiction of another worldly realm. But of course, there were exceptions. This is a 13th century Hebrew Bible from southern Germany. On the very last page is an image of the just feasting in paradise, after the final battle between good and evil at the end of time. The figures seem to be enjoying themselves, eating and drinking, whilst at either end of the table they're serenaded by musicians. Of course, what's interesting here is that each figure has an animal head, not because this is some early collection of cartoon characters, but because it was a way of getting around the prohibition on depicting the human form. And it's a rare glimpse of a Jewish heaven. On the other side of the world, things look very different. In religions such as Buddhism, which emerged in India in the 6th century BC, you can only reach a blissful state known as nirvana in this life. But to regard the Buddhist idea of nirvana as just the same as heaven would be totally wrong. In Buddhism, immortality is guaranteed, but what isn't guaranteed is the inevitability of a blissful life in heaven. Instead, Buddhists believe that the soul is constantly reincarnated in different forms time and time again, and this is called samsara. And this is a depiction, a Tibetan image, of the wheel of life that shows the 6 stages of samsara. So starting at the top here of the cycle, this is the realm of the gods. This is the realm of the demigods. This is the realm of the animals. At the bottom, with the god Yama, the king of hell, this is the realm of hell. This is the realm of the hungry ghosts. And then finally, this is the realm of the humans. And it's only from the human realm that an individual can achieve enlightenment. Now, at the core of the wheel are 3 animals: the snake, the cockerel, and the pig, symbols of greed or lust, of ignorance, and of anger. And it's they, I think, that are pivotal to deciding or pulling people back in this wheel of life. And the point, I think, for Buddhists, even though they wouldn't use this term, is that what I might call heaven, they would call enlightenment, and that enlightenment isn't depicted specifically. It's a path or a journey, but that one could say, slightly in danger of being reductive or simplistic, that paradise or heaven is everything outside of the wheel. It's managing to escape from the cycle of life. And more specifically, the image here of the Buddha pointing to the moon is a symbol of liberation, and here on the left-hand side is a Buddha in a state of enlightenment. That, I think, is the closest we get to what we might call heaven.
Nirvana is even more difficult to depict than the Christian heaven, because it's a state so different from anything we know in our experience. It is a state that is tranquil and happy. But beyond using words like tranquil and happy, Buddhists are very careful not to try and pin it down too much. I mean, yes, occasionally you can find metaphors about drops of water entering the ocean and so forth. Or the word itself is based on the idea of the extinction of a flame. But even that, I think it's quite dangerous to use a metaphor and try and build too specific a picture of what nirvana is all about, because it's so different from our experience. All the Buddha could say was that you can get there, and it's beyond all suffering, beyond all craving.
For Buddhists, then, the objective of reaching a blissful state after death, a state we might call heaven, misses the point. Improving your lot begins in the here and now, not in the endless hereafter. But the religion that promoted the promise of heaven more vigorously than any before it emerged in the Eastern Mediterranean in the early 1st century. Though Christianity borrowed much from earlier concepts of heaven, be they Greek or Jewish, its great appeal was that it threw open the gates of paradise to all who followed a godly life, irrespective of social standing. Earthly inequalities wouldn't exist in heaven, and such an idea was radical for its time. But what could the righteous hope to expect in this egalitarian heaven? For centuries, the great minds of the Christian Church debated the exact nature of heaven, but it essentially remained a very abstract idea, an unknowable, blissful union with God. It was in no way a physical place, full of pleasurable rewards. It was God and nothing else. But that left artists with a major problem. How on earth could they hope to depict such a divine vision? Heaven in Christianity has often been described as an unknowable, blissful realm. So how did artists go about depicting it? Many look back to what Jesus had said, that heaven is the kingdom of God. In most of the early depictions of Last Judgement, heaven appears as a royal court, with all the apostles, saints and angels arranged neatly in rows, flanking Christ in the centre. But images like this often had to compete for attention with gruesome but far livelier depictions of hell. So, increasingly, artists were forced to offer far more enticing visions of heaven. One such artist was the monk and painter Fra Angelico. In his altarpiece of 1431, depicting the Last Judgment, he offers a small glimpse of what heaven might be like. Though he follows a well-established means of depicting the heavenly court, Fra Angelico also includes a flowery meadow in which angels and the blessed souls dance around and around. But this human paradise is only part of Fra Angelico's vision. There's also a celestial gateway through which the righteous pass. The golden light streaming through hints at a world of pure light beyond the gates. This is the realm of the unrepresentable union with God. But as the Renaissance in Italy progressed, so the artist's vision of heaven became more humanized. This Lady Chapel of San Brizio at the cathedral here in Orvieto contains one of the most comprehensive visual accounts of Last Judgment in all of Christian art. It's the work of Luca Signorelli, a provincial painter from Cortona, who rumour had it got the job because he was the cheapest. But in a period of 3 intensive years at the very beginning of the 16th century, he produces 7 fresco images around the walls, starting with an apocalyptic image of the end of the world, as the souls prepare to be judged with this image here of the damned. This is hell, all garrotting and sadomasochistic and oddly sexualised. But the most extraordinary image, the most eye-catching in the end, and perhaps the one with the least precedence in Christian art, is his image here of heaven. Signorelli's image of heaven is florid and lyrical, and it's a mood that's amplified by the fact that the angels are sprinkling flower petals on the heads of those who are destined to go to heaven and on whose heads crowns will also be placed. And above them, other angels play musical instruments that gives the picture a kind of rhythm and a poetry. But the real mood and the real effectiveness of the work is centred on the figures down below. Signorelli's clearly looked at classical sculpture, and there's a certain idealisation of the human form going on, but they're also real, and there's a sense of them of being real human beings. Look at the angels too. There's not that much distinction between angels and human beings. And the idea is clear here, that heaven can be a place populated by real people like you and me, as well as saints and angels and other celestial creatures. And the figures have this amazing, unembarrassed sense of languidness. It's almost as if we're looking at a kind of heavenly waiting room. They chat, they hold hands, couples on earth will be couples in heaven too. And you might think it odd that they're wearing loincloths, but it's pretty clear that this was added later by censorious priests during the Counter-Reformation, and the sensuality of the image, to a certain extent, has been violated. But what Signorelli also manages to achieve is a remarkable fusion of his artistic vision and that of Fra Angelico, the man responsible for one of the early Renaissance images of the Last Judgment. Because Fra Angelico, 50 years before, had done the ceiling images here. And what happens when you stand here looking at the image of heaven is that your eye then is drawn up on the wall above the altar as the elect actually enter heaven. And then your eye goes up to the work of Fra Angelico, past this dazzling window, this celestial as well as real light. And above, there is Christ looking down, judge and, at the same time, bathed in this golden backdrop that irradiates from the window beneath it. So what Signorelli manages to achieve is giving us a feeling of a celestial pleasure dome in the upper part of the chapel. But things seem slightly more real down below. And the real effectiveness is that by painting the Last Judgment as a series of frescoes around the wall of the chapel, the viewer is cast in the role not just as spectator, but also you get the feeling that you're playing a part, and that quite literally you're caught between an image of heaven and of hell, and in the end, the choice is yours. But for many, visions like these didn't really match up to their expectations of life in paradise. For the long-suffering European peasant, life was short and harsh, and at the end of it all, they wanted their just rewards. One popular idea, at least in Northern Europe, was the fantasy known as the land of cocaine, a place of endless feasting, rest, recreation, and sexual satisfaction. In this painting, the Netherlandish artist Peter Bruegel depicts cocaine as a kind of never-never land. Everything is laid on, and all one has to do is eat and sleep. Here, a soldier, a clerk and a peasant lounge about, utterly stuffed after a monumental feast. In the background, a pig trots by with a pork chop out of its back, and a butcher's knife conveniently attached to its side, whilst in the foreground an egg ambles along, a ready-to-eat snack. This heaven is conceived in terms of what was most needed and what was most lacking on earth. That the emphasis in this paradise was on food is a strong indication of the concerns of the peasants, of whom Bruegel was so celebrated a depictor.
If you look at what people have imagined heaven as being, it nearly always is the opposite of what they've got, particularly if they don't like what they've got. So if you're living in a war zone, or if you're living in a continent that's divided by battles, you'll imagine heaven as somewhere very peaceful. If you're living in a city, and lots of the converts to Christianity were city dwellers, you'll imagine heaven as the countryside, which is where you want the rural idyll. And there's a whole rural stream that goes through Christianity. If you think about Jesus in the New Testament, where does he spend 99% of his time? In the countryside. So that kind of rural image runs through Christianity and again informs the idea of what heaven will be. If that's what Jesus liked when he was on earth, that's where Jesus will be when he's up in heaven.
The relationship between heaven and nature is an enduring one. The connection goes right back to the Garden of Eden. Here, Adam and Eve lived a blissful existence in nature. But after Eve disobeyed God by eating an apple from the tree of knowledge, paradise was lost forever. Broadly, heaven was humanity's only hope of regaining paradise. But a garden is an ordered version of nature, and in a way an attempt to regain Eden, a little paradise on earth. The relationship between the garden and heaven is a feature of many religions, but nowhere more so than in Islam. In Arabic, the word for heaven is Jannah, which means literally garden. In this image, from a manuscript describing the life of Ali, the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, paradise is pictured as a garden with a fountain at the centre. Such a scene is typical of a form of design seen in the great gardens of the Islamic world. Though depictions of religious subjects do exist in Islam, these are never the focus of devotion. Religious understanding is firmly rooted in the word of the Quran, the Muslim holy book. And it's in the Quran that we get a clear description of what to expect in heaven. It's a world of fine and abundant foods, of trees laden with fruit, and rivers flowing with milk, water, and even alcohol.
When we enter into paradise, we won't be scared. We will not get cold. We will not get sick. So yes, there are descriptions of gardens, water, beautiful houses there, beautiful companionship for male, for women. You can have whatever you desire. It's a limitless world.
The luxurious, sensual paradise found in Islam is in keeping with what perhaps most people in the West today might hope heaven is like. But there's also another idea that features strongly in people's imaginations, that of heaven as a place of familiarity, a place of reunion. In 20th century Christian art, the emphasis has been on personal vision, and nowhere is this more apparent than in the work of the British painter Stanley Spencer. In this painting, completed in 1927, we see Spencer's imagined version of the resurrection, in which heaven is not a celestial sphere far above, but Spencer's own parish churchyard in the small village of Cookham, 50 miles or so up the Thames Valley from London. All around, people are bursting out of their graves, emerging into the paradise of a summer's day in Cookham, under the watchful gaze of not only Old Testament prophets such as Moses, seen clutching the Ten Commandments, but Jesus and God himself, both pictured in the rose-covered porch. Spencer's seen not once but twice in the painting. He's joined by his friends and neighbours, and most importantly, his new wife Hilda, with whom he was deeply in love. Heaven for Spencer was the here and now. For him, love and his local village were paradise enough.
Heaven as a personal and romantic idea looms large in this work by the British artist Tracey Emin. Emin produces something that reads rather as a painting, but in fact it's stitched and embroidered and uses different kinds of fabrics to produce a banner, in effect, that proclaims, "Meet me in heaven, I'll wait for you." And there's something adolescently yearning about the piece. And the idea of heaven here is where, in the end, what can't happen on earth, what can't be resolved, what seems obsessive and full of agony, in the end can be resolved in this other place later on. But actually there's something more interesting going on than simple teenage angst in the work. Emin herself has an English mother and a Turkish Cypriot father. And you can see these two emblems looming large. On the right, the flag of St. George. On the left, the Turkish crescent moon. But they also read as religious symbols, the Christian cross and the crescent moon of Islam. And in a way, one of the ways of reading this piece is the idea that in heaven, wherever that may be, this kind of opposition, this kind of antagonism, this kind of aggression ultimately can be resolved. Also, the medium itself gives the message, meet me in heaven, I'll wait for you, a more gentler edge. But take the same message and put it in a different medium, and you get a rather different reading. Now, by producing the same words in neon, Emin gives the piece this feeling of ethereality. It has a kind of otherworldly glow that many people equate with the idea of heaven. She also personalises it. This is her own writing transformed into neon. And in a sense, the viewer looking at this piece personalises his or her view of heaven. This exists as a phrase or as a concept. It could have been taken from a popular song or from a film, but it requires a leap of imagination on behalf of the viewer, as most conceptual art does. On another level, though, she's depersonalising it or universalising it, because by having the idea of heaven reduced to a word in neon, in the 21st century, this can be read as simply reducing heaven to the idea of a logo or a brand.
A recent opinion poll revealed that despite living in an increasingly secular world, 70% of people in the West still believe in heaven. Many live in a far more hedonistic world, where expectations of life, and by extension life after death, are far higher. And although heaven is the most elusive of all religious ideas, the vast majority still believe it's where we'll end up when we die. Art has played a crucial role in the formation of this belief. It offers a window onto another world, as well as an escape from the material realm which we inhabit. But, as we shall see in the final programme in this series, fear is almost always more immediate than happiness, and hell has proved a much more powerful subject for the artistic imagination.